So today we are going to discuss one of the most important chapters that is in the syllabus of GATE Biomedical Engineering. So this chapter is called as Kinematics of Human Movements. So first let us see what are anatomical reference planes. So first you have to know what are cardinal planes actually. So cardinal planes are actually three imaginary perpendicular reference planes that divide the body in half by mass. So they are actually three imaginary planes, perpendicular planes, which divide the body into half. So these are called as cardinal planes. There are three major types of cardinal planes. We have number one sagittal plane, number two frontal plane, and number three is the transverse plane. So sagittal plane is the plane in which the forward and the backward movements of the body and body segments occur. Like when you run, you will notice the motion of the arms and the legs, right? So the motion of the arms and the legs during running occur in the sagittal plane. So here in this figure on the right hand side, the red plane that you see, that is dividing the body vertically into two halves, this red plane is actually the sagittal plane. Now what is the frontal plane? Frontal plane is actually the plane in which the lateral movements of the body and the body segments occur. Like when you do side stepping or side kicks or jumping jacks, then you perform all these types of motions in the frontal plane. If you look at this figure, you will see that this is the frontal plane, the blue plane that is dividing the body into two halves. This is the frontal plane. So another plane we have, which is called as a transverse plane, in which the horizontal movements of the body segments occur, like when a diver performs a twist or a trampolinist. So they all perform these type of motions in the transverse plane. If you look at in this figure, this green plane that is dividing the body segment into two halves, this is called as the horizontal or transverse plane. Now, apart from the three different anatomical reference planes, we also have three types of anatomical reference axis corresponding to the three planes. So number one, we have the frontal axis. If you look at in this figure, you will notice this is the frontal axis, while this is the frontal plane. So frontal axis is actually along the frontal plane, and it is perpendicular to the sagittal plane as well as the sagittal axis. You also will notice that here we have the sagittal axis. So sagittal axis likewise is along the sagittal plane, and it is perpendicular to the frontal axis as well as the frontal plane. And the last one that we have is the longitudinal axis. So this is the longitudinal axis that we have. So it is perpendicular to both the sagittal axis as well as the frontal axis. Please watch this diagram very carefully. Now we will analyze in detail the movements along the three different planes. So first we have sagittal plane movements. So the first type of movement that we have in the sagittal plane is the flexion, which includes anteriorly directed sagittal plane rotations of the head, trunk, upper arm, forearm, hand and the hip, and the posteriorly directed sagittal plane rotation of the lower leg. Like here in this figure, you will see the first figure is of flexion. So when you move the hand away from the anatomical mid dorsal line of the body along the sagittal plane, so you perform flexion. While if you move the hand backwards towards the anatomical midline of the body along the sagittal plane, opposite to the direction of flexion, you get the extension. And if you move the hand away from anatomical reference position, beyond the anatomical reference position, in the direction opposite to flexion, okay, if you move the hand beyond the anatomical reference position, you get hyperextension. So you have mainly three types of sagittal plane movements of the upper trunk. Okay, number one is the flexion, when you move the body segments from the anatomical midline of the body. The number two is the extension, when you move the body segments towards the anatomical midline of the body. And number three is the hyperextension, when you move the body segments beyond the anatomical reference position in the direction opposite to the direction of flexion. We have another sagittal plane movement which is particularly of the leg. So when you move the feet or the leg away from the midline of the body, it is called as dorsiflexion, and if you move the leg towards the midline of the body in the sagittal plane, then it is called as the plantar flexion. Now we come to frontal plane movements. So the frontal plane movements include abduction, which is the movement of the body segment away from the midline of the body along the frontal plane. So if you move the body segment away from the midline of the body, like in this figure, as you can see, the leg is moving away from the midline of the body in the frontal plane, then it is called as abduction. While if you move the leg towards the central mid-dorsal line of the body along the frontal plane, you perform adduction. Now this abduction and adduction, these two motions mainly take place at the hip. We have another types of frontal plane movements which are elevation and depression. So these two types of frontal plane movements mainly take place at the shoulder girdle. So when you move the shoulder girdle in the superior position, that is, if you move the shoulder girdle upwards, you perform elevation, and if you move the shoulder girdle in the inferior direction, like if you move the shoulder girdle downwards in the frontal plane, you perform depression. Now this elevation and depression together take place only at the shoulder girdle in the frontal plane. In frontal plane, we have also two different types of motions which are called as pronation and supination. So the pronation takes place at the subtalar joint, and it is actually a combination of eversion, abduction and dorsiflexion. So it is actually a combination of three different types of movements. If you combine eversion, abduction and dorsiflexion, you get pronation. Okay, likewise in case of supination, you combine inversion, adduction and plantar flexion. So here you can see, if you move the forearm in this direction, this is called as pronation. This is also called as palms down position. And if you move the forearm in this direction, it is called as a supination. This is also called as a palms up position. Okay, if you perform the same thing with your feet, okay, if you move this away from the, if you move your feet away from the mid dorsal line of the body along the reference plane, then you get pronation. And if you move it in this direction, in this way, okay, then you perform supination. So third plane movement that we have is transverse plane movement. So the first type of movement in transverse plane includes medial rotation, which is rotation of an arm or a leg in the transverse plane. So if you rotate an arm or a leg in a transverse plane, likewise if you rotate your leg in this way along the transverse plane, this is called as medial rotation. But if you rotate your leg in this way along the transverse plane, it is called as lateral rotation. Likewise in transverse plane, we have another two types of movement which are called as the eversion and inversion. So if you move your foot or feet outwards from the mid dorsal line of the body along the transverse plane, this is called as eversion. While if you move your foot or feet away from the mid dorsal line of the body inwards, it is called as inversion. We have also another two different types of motions in a transverse plane. So I have already discussed abduction and adduction in the frontal plane, right? So you can perform a modified form of abduction adduction in the transverse plane as well, which is when arm at the thigh is flexed to a position such that movement of the arm and the thigh takes place from an anterior position to a lateral position in the transverse plane. It is called as horizontal abduction. This is what we call as horizontal abduction. So when you move the arm of the thigh from an anterior position to a lateral position, so this was your anterior position, this is your lateral position. So when you move the arm of the thigh away from the anterior position to a lateral position along the transverse plane, it is called as horizontal abduction. Right? You perform this kind of exercises during yoga or gym classes. But if you move the arm of the thigh from the lateral position, that is if you perform the reverse one from the lateral position to the anterior position, then it is called as horizontal adduction. So general abduction adduction occur in the transverse plane, but specific types of abduction adduction which are called as horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction, these two occur at the horizontal plane, mostly at the shoulders. So here we will discuss some special types of movements. We have three special types of movements. Number one, circumduction. Number two, opposition. And number three, reposition. So what is circumduction? Circumduction is actually a combination of four types of movements. That is abduction, adduction, flexion and extension. So it is actually a motion that describes along a circle. Suppose on the right hand side, this is what is called as circumduction. If you rotate the fingertip about an imaginary circle at the metacarpal joint while keeping the rest of the hand stationary, so this is called as circumduction. Now opposition is bringing the thumb towards the finger. So this is what is opposition. So this is the thumb, and if you bring the thumb towards any one of the fingers, this is called as opposition. Okay, and the reverse of opposition is called as reposition. So if you move the thumb away from the one of the fingers, it is called as reposition. That is returning the thumb away from the fingers and bringing them towards the anatomical reference position.